Welcome to this InfoSecurity Europe podcast.
Hi, I'm John Smith. I head up the solution architecture team for Veracode in EMEA and Asia Pacific. Veracode are a company that provide software security testing technology for organizations that need to make their software more secure, which pretty much is every organization. Thinking about the biggest information security threats to businesses at the moment, well, my particular perspective tends to be a little bit focused in on the world of software security, which I think is a pretty good contender for the biggest threat that organizations face today. Every business is a software business today, and that becomes ever more true as time goes on. And the nature of software development and the way that that's working with the security part of an organization, it doesn't feel like it's becoming easier. The world of software is moving ever faster, moving towards more iterative DevOps kind of software development methodologies. So we've got this great pace, great velocity happening, great change happening in software. Meanwhile, security is finding it hard to align with that, to stay in tune with that. Particularly if we look back 10, 15 years, there was a mindset of, doing a pre-production test. Well, that's totally irrelevant in modern world, because pre-production would mean you'd be doing it multiple times per day in some organizations. The whole idea of kind of checklists and of security doing an audit and then throwing those findings over to a software development organization and say, no, just go off and fix this. It's not something that can work in today's world, and it's totally misaligned to the way that modern software development works and the culture that exists in modern software development. Even just the term DevOps, it's about breaking down silos between the people that develop the software and the people that operate the software, and actually saying, you built it, you operate it, you work together as one cohesive unit, collective responsibility. And we can't keep security being on the side of that. They've got to become part of it. So to return to the original idea of, what's the biggest threat that organizations face? Well, I don't know whether software security is the single biggest threat. There's a lot of damaging and worrying things out there. But within the world of software security, the biggest threat is, I think, that security, the world of security and the world of software development are not always coming together as they should. They're not coming together. And if they don't come together, we don't end up with the right outcome. So how can companies work to avoid these kind of problems, work to avoid security issues in software? Well, there are a number of different things that we can look at here. Technology absolutely plays a part. And the things that Veracode does in terms of automated testing of your software to identify issues in the code that you wrote, as well as issues in the code that you employ, that you pull in, that you can compose your application of. Typically, we're talking about open source components that are made use of in the application. There are technologies there that can help you to identify issues that exist in your software, which gives you the opportunity to do something about them and fix them. But again, it's not necessarily quite as simple as saying, well, technology can save the day here, because it's not just about the technology. The technology can tell you that there are problems. You've still got to do something about those problems. You've actually got to fix those problems. If it's a problem in your own first-party code, developers have to make code changes to remediate that, to fix that, or at least introduce some other kind of mitigating control that's going to stop it from being a problem. And then there's the code that you didn't write, all of that, those open source components. I mean, I can't remember what the exact number is now, but something like 80% of the code that makes up a modern application is not code that you wrote, it's code that you pulled in from open source components. So that itself in itself provides a huge problem. And for that code, you don't tend to fix the code itself. You need to say, okay, well, there's a newer version of that library, newer version of that component that I can pull in, that'll update it. It won't have that security issue. But even that's not something where you can just stand still, because it doesn't have any known security issues today. But security research is constantly ongoing. New vulnerabilities are being identified in code and being published. So the component that you thought you'd upgraded to a more secure component, or you thought you'd selected a really good component in the first place, in a week's time, a month's time, 6 months' time, 12 months' time, a researcher or even just the people that produced the code in the first place might realize that there's an issue in that. And they might publish that issue, and you might or might not become aware that that issue exists in this component that you're using. It's actually been a big focus of our most recent State of Software Security report, which is all about open source components, how they're being used, how they're being maintained, and where the issues are being found in them, and what's being done about them. And there's a huge amount of data in there that's I think going to be helpful. So, pulling all of this back as to what should organizations be doing, absolutely, there are automated technologies that can be brought to bear to help increase the amount of information you have about the security posture of the software that you're developing. You've then also got to have the communication, the process, and frankly, the will and the prioritization to say that these issues that we're finding in our software are something we are going to invest effort and time and money to fix, because it matters. So I mentioned the State of Software Security report in there. And as I said, the latest report that we've done, version 11, it's all about the open source problem, I suppose you could call it, or at least the state of open source as it relates to software development. And, there were a number of things that really came out quite strongly from that report. The first, and I don't think this is great, enormous news for anyone, is that there is an enormous amount of open source components being used in modern software development. And that's a good thing. Another of the things that came through pretty clearly was that there's a really strong tendency for those components to be carefully selected. When we looked at the survey that we did, in addition to our data, we also did a survey of developers. A large majority of organizations have a process for selecting the open source components or the third-party components they're going to be using. And in a lot of cases, that includes factors like license risk and security risk. So informed decisions being made, but once the decision has been made, it's never being revisited. The components aren't being updated. They're just, great, we've made a good choice. We've chosen the component that provides the functionality we need and meets the requirements that we've set for this. And then we stop and we move on and we worry about something else now. It's like I've solved this problem. But as I mentioned before, that problem doesn't go away. It just festers. So over time, there's a quote in the report, I think, that says something like open source components age like milk. And anyone that's ever been away on holiday and come back and realized that they left a pint of milk in the fridge, or worse still, on the side, knows that milk doesn't age fantastically well. Absolutely true of open source components. They have new issues identified in them. And at that point, you now know, or you should know at that point, that you've got a vulnerable component. Do you do anything about it? In an awful lot of cases, I think the number's somewhere around about 80% of cases, those things don't get changed, they don't get fixed, they don't get updated. And the really disappointing thing about that is how trivial the change often is. Now, absolutely, there are cases where to move from a vulnerable version of a component to a less or non-vulnerable version of a component does actually require major version update, major change, and that does require refactoring of code. It's a bunch of work. So I'm not trying to suggest that it's always trivial, but actually 60, 70% of the time, it's a minor version update. It's something that's not going to change the APIs, not going to change the core functionality. It's a pretty trivial thing. And what we found in the survey and through the data that we analysed in the report is that when developers are given the right information, when they're given the context, when they understand that there's a vulnerability and that the update required to fix that vulnerability is relatively minor, you find enormous numbers of issues being fixed really quite quickly. Without that context, without that information, it just stays there. You know, and 6 months, a year later, you can find you've still got exactly the same security issues in the code, sitting there waiting to be found and exploited by the unscrupulous. So yeah, I think you know, this is a shameless plug for the State of Software Security report, volume 11. Well worth reading, lots of data in there, but if you take one thing away from it, it's that there will always be new issues identified in open source components, and an awful lot of the time the changes that are required in order to remove those security issues from your code base are trivial. They're just a minor version upgrade of a component. So you know, let's all get out there and clean up our dependencies a little bit. Info security, what a great show. I've been, you wouldn't know it from my youthful good looks, but I've been doing this kind of stuff for quite a long time now. And, you know, as an annual moment in my calendar, info security has been one of those things that I look forward to every year. You know, I think back over the years that I've been attending info security, you know, from one point of view, the colleagues that I've met there, colleagues that I don't necessarily work with anymore, but within the industry, you know, the people that you bump into as you wander around, you know, it's a wonderful event from a social point of view. But on top of that, it's one of those times where you get to see the breadth of the world of information security. You know, you get an organization like us focused on application security. Next door booth might be someone focused on email security. You know, the breadth of what matters in the world of information security, both from a vendor point of view and also the thought leadership, the keynote sessions, all of the presentations that kind of inform you across this breadth. I think it's a relatively unique event, certainly within the UK and within, you know, the space that we operate in. So yeah, it's a fantastic event.
Thank you for listening to this Info Security Europe podcast.